Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our FSK from Home series. I'm Margot Kopera, Public Programs Manager at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Thank you, everyone who has joined us today, and for those who have donated to our FSK from Home Giving Challenge. Thank you for this incredible support. It really does make a difference and has a major impact on all of our work here. If you would like to donate during the program, check the chat for the donation link. This year, as we have told you before, for our FSK seasons, we have pulled back the curtain on our collections. Connect with MCHC staff and our colleagues as they reveal the stories behind the objects we preserve, interpret, and display. And today, we will be highlighting one of those long-standing partnerships with historic St. Mary's City, the site of Maryland's first capital. The Maryland Center for History and Culture and Historic St. Mary's City currently offer a joint membership program that gives members of both institutions greater access and opportunities to learn about Maryland's diverse history, connecting people across the state. Our institution's education programs, collections, and interpretation of Maryland's prehistory and early narratives align with historic St. Mary's City. We look forward to how we can continue to build together as new discoveries come to light. Our conversation today starts with my colleague at MCHC, Katie Caljean. Katie manages multiple aspects of public engagement at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and at the leadership level, she oversees public programs, K through 12 and university level programming, youth and family programming, adult tours, outreach and community partnerships, marketing and communications, and publications. Katie seeks to challenge and empower students and adults to think through objects critically, analyze and interrogate sources of information, craft arguments based on evidence and observations, and generate meaningful dialogues. She is also committed to data-driven decision-making and is a global thinker and problem solver who strives to align organizational planning with the needs of audiences and communities. Katie is also a Calvert descendant and joined us here at MCHC back in 2012 and has served in many capacities here throughout the organization, ranging from fundraising activities to strategic planning. She is originally from New Jersey, but Katie holds a BA in anthropology with minors in archaeology and arts administration from Drew University and an MA in museum anthropology and from Columbia University, and a joint graduate program with the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. So with this passion for pre-Columbian ceramics and material culture, she's conducted archaeological fieldwork and ecotourism projects in coastal and highland Ecuador, Peru, Wyoming, and Arizona. And she makes for a perfect person for this conversation today. Thank you, Katie, for hosting.
Thank you, Margot. And I'm so excited to actually be able to talk archaeology. Oftentimes, yes. I feel, it is where my heart lies, and I really love to talk about material culture. So I'm thrilled to welcome Travis to our conversation today. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Travis. Dr. Travis Parno is the Director of Research and Collections at Historic St. Mary's City and the Project Director of the People to People Project. He has over 15 years of experience excavating and researching historic sites in Maryland, Virginia, Massachusetts, and Bermuda. In addition to overseeing the Department of Research and Collections, Travis runs Historic St. Mary's City's annual field school in historical archaeology, the country's longest running program of its kind. Did not know that. He received his PhD in archaeology from Boston University in 2013. Travis's primary research interests include early Indigenous colonial relations in the English Atlantic world, the social and legal origins of slavery in Maryland, the functions of ordinaries in the 17th century Chesapeake, and the role of archaeology in museums. Travis is the author and editor of various publications detailing his research, and he has presented numerous papers at academic conferences beginning in 2007. So Travis, welcome. We are so thrilled to have you today as part of our virtual public program conversation about historic St. Mary's City and the discoveries that you have recently unearthed. We can't wait to hear more. So I would like to turn it over to you to kind of give us a broad overview of the work that has been done and where you're headed.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Katie, and thanks to you and Margot and to the MCHC for welcoming me today. I think Margot said it best that HSMC and MCHC, all of our acronyms together, really do have a shared mission in elevating the role of Maryland history to a national level, and that's really one of our tasks. And so I'm happy to participate in the conversation. And today I'm just going to be talking briefly about the work that doing at the site of St. Mary's Fort, which is the founding site of the Maryland colony. And today you see from my slide, I've called this challenging narratives, because I think this is sort of the period that we are in as an agency and as a discipline in archaeology and anthropology, as we continue to challenge narratives. And that's not to discount any work that's been done previously. It's just that as we continue to reflect and be reflexive on the work that has come before us, and as we continue to discover new things, those narratives continue to evolve. So at Historic St. Mary's City, as I mentioned, we're looking at this in the context of St. Mary's Fort. Now, for anyone who is unfamiliar with where Historic St. Mary's City is located, we're down in the southern end of southern Maryland, about as far south as you can go without getting wet. And so if you come down to our site, we're about an hour and a half south of Washington, D.C. We're about 2 hours south of Baltimore, beautiful spot right along the river. And to get us a little closer to our location, we, as a museum, are responsible for about 833 acres of the St. Mary's City National Historic Landmark, shown here on this slide. In this area, we often are pitched as kind of the museum of Maryland's first capital, and that's absolutely the case. But we do have a history that both precludes the capital and certainly extends past that capital period. And so that's part of this idea of expanding our narratives, at the very least, to encompass a fuller history. I've put up this painting here just because this is sort of a quintessential 19th century vision of the founding of Maryland, which is so salient to the excavations that we're conducting today at the site of St. Mary's Fort. And this image is about as romantic imagery gets in the 19th century, of showing what those early moments after 150 or so colonists sailed from England and landed in Maryland in March of 1634. And they arrived eventually at a site that is today called St. Mary's City, but at the time was home to a people called the Yakomico. And this painting is designed to sort of envision what that first meeting of the Yakomico would have looked like. And it's replete with this wonderful romantic imagery, wonderful if you are a 19th century apologist, sort of looking back, imagining what this could be. But just looking at the composition of this image, you see Father Andrew White, presumably presiding, the Jesuit priest presiding over this sort of diplomatic proceeding, occupying the highest position in this painting, while in the foreground you have Native American individuals, men and women, sort of offering goods and material culture almost in supplication. And so there's a real power dynamic at play in imagery like this. And if we look at another image that should certainly be familiar to MCHC, since it is in your collections, this one by Atchison Woodward is at least a little bit truer to what some of those early meetings would have looked like, where you have people on a similar plane. This idea that the colonists were a small group of people stepping into a heavily populated region full of multiple power players who had been jockeying for political and social supremacy for generations, for hundreds of years. And so they were this small group kind of really entering a world of great complexity. And so I like the woodward painting because it at least sort of evens things out a little bit. And so when I talk about that idea of that deep history that we have here, and that's one of those, again, one of those narratives that we're looking at St. Mary's City, which if you come to our landscape is full of reconstructed colonial dwellings. But the history here stretches backwards much deeper in time. We know this both from our history, oral history, as well as archaeology. The artifact shown here, a Palmer Point, is one of the earliest artifacts found on our site, found just hundreds of feet from where the site of St. Mary's Fort is located. And so we know people have been living in this part of what is today Maryland for 10, 12, probably upwards of 14,000 years. And that over time, societies evolved and groups rose and fell in terms of political prominence. But by the time the Ark and the Dove arrived here on the shores, we know that the principal power players were the Piscataway. The Piscataway were the sort of the dominant group here on the western shore of Maryland. And there were numerous other tribes that lived in this region, but most of them were sort of under the umbrella of power of the Piscataway. The Piscataway had their seat of power at a site known as Moyone, sort of up on the northern end of the Potomac. And so the colonists, when they arrived, were at least wise to the fact that they should ingratiate themselves to the leadership who existed in this area. But for their part, in fact, for his part, the man named Wanis was the leader, the Tayak of the Piscataway people at this time. His people had been dealing with incursions for a number of years from a number of other indigenous groups and also from other colonial groups. There was a group called the Susquehannocks who had been coming down, raiding through from Pennsylvania down from the northern end of the Chesapeake and attacking the Piscataway people. There's other groups like the Massawomack who are coming from sort of the west of where Moyone was located, where the Piscataway were located, potentially in sort of the panhandle of West Virginia. And then a group called the Patawomack had attacked the Piscataway from the south, from the Virginia side of the Potomac. And in 1622, in fact, they had allied with the Virginia colonial government to attack the Piscataway. So as these Maryland colonists are arriving, the Piscataway were savvy to the situation. They understood what European settler colonists could bring as far as potential conflict, but also potential military allies, and particularly at a time where the Piscataway are surrounded by potential enemies. And so Wanis meets the colonists with the leadership of the colony, represented by Governor Leonard Calvert, Maryland's first governor. And according to the colonial records, he had 500 bowmen at his side, sort of expressing this power of saying, yes, you are coming to me. I am the principal power broker here, and let's chat. And so as that conversation continued, the colonists got the idea from Wanis that he really didn't want them settling near Moyone and instead encouraged them to head elsewhere in the region. And so on the advice of a fur trader named Henry Fleet, the colonists sailed back down the Potomac and settled at what would become St. Mary's City, or at the time occupied by a people called the Yakomico. And they did what most colonists did. When colonies are being started, they typically would build some sort of fortification, often something that could function as almost a citadel to retreat back to in the case of conflict. And this rendering here was drawn by Dr. Carrie Carson, a preeminent architectural historian. Beautiful piece of artwork. It was done back in 1972. And we like to sort of joke today that this image, based on what we know now, is about maybe 30% accurate. And this image is based primarily on the one really good description that we have of what St. Mary's Fort looked like. And you'll understand why Dr. Carson drew this image the way he did. Because in a letter written by Governor Calvert back to one of his friends and financiers in England, Sir Richard Letchford, and this letter dated May 30th of 1634, in addition to a whole bunch of other details about the voyage, he mentions, we have seated ourselves within 1/2 mile of the river, within a palisado of 120 yards square with 4 flanks. We've mounted 1 piece of ordnance, and we've placed 6 murderers, which is a type of kind of short cannon, in parts most convenient, a fortification we think sufficient to defend against any such weak enemies as we have reason to expect here. And there's some key elements in this description. He gives us a bit of a location, right? We're within 1/2 mile of the river. He tells us we're in a palisaded fort. So a palisade being the sort of construction of taking wooden timbers, stacking them in a trench side by side vertically to create a strong, tall wooden wall. He gives us the dimensions of the fort, about 120 yards square. And then he says with 4 flanks, which is kind of a strange thing to say, having already described something as square. Typically, you tell me something square, I know it's got 4 sides. You don't also need to tell me it has 4 sides. So because of the spelling of this word, we've typically interpreted this to be a misspelling of the word flanker, the military term for a bastion or circular or square outwork that would appear typically on the corners of forts to provide cannon emplacement, a spot where anyone trying to defend the walls could sort of reach out and fire down the walls as they're being attacked. He mentions the ordnance that's been mounted there and then identifies those threats as potentially weak enemies, which is a key piece of data. And so again, you can see why Dr. Carson rendered his drawing the way it was. It's a large square fortification. It's got corner bastions. And so it sort of makes sense. But for a fortification this size, it's strange that in 5 decades of archaeology, it had never been located. And there were a couple ideas of where it could possibly be based on some archaeology, but also based on kind of historical data. The first of those we call the traditional site because tradition holds that that's where the fort was located. And it's right there along the banks of the St. Mary's. And this tradition comes from another architectural historian, a man named Dr. Henry Chanley Foreman, who in 1938 published this wonderfully titled book, Jamestown and St. Mary's Buried Cities of Romance, based off of archaeological and historical study of these 2 sites. And in the back cover of his book, you can see he's got St. Mary's Fort as this square bastion fort right there along the river. And if you align this image with the actual landform, here's Dr. Foreman's book. You can see where he's got his image, and that shows us roughly where Dr. Foreman thought the fort would be. And some archaeology there did support the idea that there were some early 17th century artifacts that came out from that area. On the other site where we thought the fort might be located is called the Mill Field, because there's a creek called Mill Creek, freshwater creek that runs adjacent to this field. And there were a couple of mills built on that property in the 17th century. And some early artifacts have been found in that field as well. And so looking at these 2 sites, the traditional site, it offers you the benefit of commanding the river. If you put your cannon right there along the river, a ship sails up that river and you can fire it full of cannonballs. And there's some early artifacts that were found there, but it doesn't quite fit Governor Calvert's letter where he says the fort was located within 1/2 mile of the river. Whereas the Millfield location, it does fit that description. It is about 1/2 mile from the St. Mary's. Some early artifacts were found out there, but it doesn't give you any military command over the river. If you're going to mount cannon there, you're not going to be using them to take out any sort of European or other colonial vessels. And so when I arrived at St. Mary's City back in 2016, I was really intrigued by the question of where St. Mary's Fort is, particularly given how much work had happened here. I had spent some time as an undergraduate student at William & Mary working at Jamestown. And so having that experience working at James Fort, really seeing what that could do for the history of the state and how it could really energize people about the colonial period. So I ended up seeking a grant through the Maryland Historical Trust, and we used that grant to hire a geophysicist, shown 3 times here. This is Dr. Tim Horsley. Dr. Horsley is one of the preeminent geophysicists working in the country today. And a geophysicist essentially takes scientific instrumentation and uses it to look below the ground without actually having to excavate. So he used 3 different techniques. The one that was most important for us was that ground penetrating radar, which sends radar waves below the ground, and anything that it hits that's not sort of clean, uninterrupted soil, so anything like a pit or a trench or a brick foundation, is going to bounce those radar waves back up. You pick that up and then you can map it. And where you see those features, that gives you a sense of where an archaeological site might have been. So Dr. Horsley went out, he surveyed the traditional site and didn't find a whole lot other than some groundhog holes. But he got out to the mill field, and within a very short time, he found something that looked like this. This image shows, it sort of looks like a CAT scan of the ground, and hopefully you can see from this image, I think I can trace with my mouse here. I'm hoping you can see this pointer, that there's a straight line that's sort of running down the middle of that image. Looks like a series of black dots. and it curves around to form a circle around kind of a big black blob there in the middle left of the image. And then that straight line continues back down to the southeast to kind of form a corner. It continues back up to the northeast. We sort of lose it in a little bit of geological disturbance. And then there's a tiny segment of it on the northeast side that maybe you can see. And to show you what this looks like a little more clearly, this is what Dr. Horsley had found, a large rectangular enclosure. And we know it's an enclosure because those black dots that make up that line are the remains of individual timbers that formed a palisade wall. So we have a large palisaded enclosure. The odd thing about this is, hopefully you can see on the left-hand side, sort of the west side of this enclosure, there's one kind of circular area. That's one bastion, but there's not four, and it's not a square, and it's not 120 yards square either. It's about 104 yards by about 58 yards. So thinking about challenging narratives, we've got to challenge Governor Calvert's letter here because this doesn't quite make sense for us. And there's a whole other mess of things that were found as part of this survey. This map is just to show you each of those little symbols and dots and squares generally represent cultural features that were part of buildings or part of pits and other sorts of landscape features that Dr. Horsley found through his survey. So based off of that survey, we've reconstructed what we think this site would have looked like. We've done some archaeology out there to test that, yes, it actually is from the early 17th century period. So it is St. Mary's Fort, even though the size doesn't quite work out. And one thing I just want to highlight before we jump into the question portion is among the results of that archaeology, in addition to the colonial artifacts, has been the traces of the millennia of occupation of people living in this region. The projectile point that you see here on the left is about 5,000 or 6,000 years old, and the ceramic piece that's shown on the right is probably about 1,500 to 2,000 years old. So we get that sense of the long-term occupation here. And so in order to really kind of honor that and also set St. Mary's Fort in context, we've gone back to a previous archaeological study that was done back in the 1980s in another portion of the mill field. And that identified two other indigenous site components, that predate St. Mary's Fort. The one sort of large bubble that you see there, all those dots are individual artifacts that were discovered during a survey. And so the site on sort of the northwest side, the larger oval, dates to, we think, probably about 5,000 to 8,000 years old. And then the encircled area there is a site that dates to probably around 1,500 to 2,000 years old. And so when we look at the mill field in its entirety, you can see you've got these three large sites, the two indigenous sites shown in red circles, and then St. Mary's Fort shown with the blue rectangle. We want to look at all of these sites in context, in conversation with one another. And so we've constructed a new initiative called the People-to-People Project, and you can check out our website there. And the People-to-People Project seeks to use the mill field as kind of a laboratory for understanding human life in Southern Maryland. And so we want to capture what life was like as best as we can for the thousands of years prior to colonial arrival, such that when people visit the site, they'll be able to walk through interpreted areas, maybe see reconstructed indigenous dwellings or indigenous campsites along with interpretive signage, and get all of that history as much as you can in a brief amount of time before arriving at the site of St. Mary's Fort, where we have these ongoing excavations. And we think doing this will really help set this entire story in context. So that's sort of the setup for where we are today as our excavations continue. But I'll stop for a minute so I can get Katie back in here.
Oh, that was very, very helpful to frame out all of the work that you've been doing. So how long has this project been going on? How many summers?
Yeah, we did the excavations in 2019 to really confirm that, yes, this is the site that we think it is, because we had wrapped up the geophysical survey with Dr. Horsley at the end of 2018. And so, we don't tend to make big announcements about site identification based solely on geophysics. We like to do what's called ground truthing, where we do that with to confirm that what the geophysicists saw is actually present there. And so we had our annual summer field school with college students from all around the country out with us in the summer of 2019. We didn't actually tell them what they were working on because we weren't confident yet in what we had necessarily. So
prove the science, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I felt I felt bad being so circumspect and sort of surreptitious about the whole thing, but we were able to share the announcement with them afterwards. But it was at the end of 2019 when we said, yes, we feel like we've got it. We're going to make a big announcement in Maryland Day of 2020, but of course March of 2020 brought all new challenges for us. So we've been out there now, really including 2019. We were able to get out for part of a season in 2020. So yeah, we're going on 3 years.
Yeah, I like this framework of challenging what we know, right? And I'm always drawn to, well, how do we know what we know, and what is the evidence that corroborates the past? And oftentimes, as Western culture, we're drawn to the written word, and somehow that has some more truth or value because it was written. So how do you see the role of material culture in storytelling? And also thinking about like what you were talking about, geophysical survey, right? Like that can't stand alone. It's really all of these pieces together. And how do you use them to be like points of checks and balance to prove or disprove your hypotheses about what had been occurring at a location, right? So it's really all those pieces together, and how do you use them, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word that you use there is hypothesis is so critical. The idea that archaeologists sort of deal in truth is not really something that we as anthropologists today really subscribe to. Just as the written word has certain aspects to it that are helpful to us as historians, we also know that when we today write anything down, it comes through is filtered through a certain amount of inherent bias. And so as we look back on the written record, we have to view it with that degree of circumspection, and really understand that anything that's written comes from a perspective. It's the same way for us when we interpret material culture. The assemblage that I look at that has X number of ceramic sherds and Y number of iron nails and all this sort of thing, I'm going to bring my own interpretation to that based off of all of the data that brings to bear. But someone else who comes from a different political or philosophical bent may have a slightly different interpretation. Now, we're not going to necessarily look at the same colonial data set and say, yes, this was put here by the Mayans 4,000 years ago, but we may have a different read on exactly the importance of one object over another. And so I'm always hesitant when people look at archaeology and say, well, you're finding the stuff that people left, therefore you're finding the truth, as opposed to what's written, which is all subjective. And it's really a balance. It's about looking at the data set, which encompasses, as you say, written record, material record, oral history, the visual record, if there's visual media. There's a whole wealth of sources that we draw from, scientific analysis. All of that gets sort of put into a package, and we have to look at all of that and say, okay, based on what we have here, here's what we think happened at this particular site at a particular time. But as you say, challenging the narratives, all of that is evolving based off of new discoveries, new advances in scientific methodology, et cetera.
Right. And it's like really looking to that constellation of evidence to derive an interpretation. And in museums, we do the same thing, right? We look to our collections, we look to our oral history, we look to our archives. And from that, it still will be processed through a person in a particular moment in time. So interpretation is so important, and it is important for us to be thinking about that when we're reading anything. So when you approached this project, what did you think you were going to find, and how is that different from how you now think about the site?
I mean, I was certainly hopeful that we were going to find a fort, and for a few months when we brought in Dr. Horsley, it wasn't looking good. When we used, I mentioned we had 3 different methods that we threw at this thing, and it was really designed to kind of narrow our focus, because ground penetrating radar is wonderful, as you saw from that image, that it gave a pretty clear indication that we've got a big rectangular fort with one bastion. I mean, that level of kind of resolution you can't get with most other geophysical methods, and that's because it takes a really long time to do ground penetrating radar. Dr. Horsley, with his little thing, looks like kind of a lawnmower, walked, I believe he said 72 miles in about a 2-week period, going back and forth with this thing, and it just takes an exorbitant amount of time. So by the time we got to that, I was very, very glad, certainly. But I was really expecting a square fort with 4 bastions. I'm not going to lie. You have a letter. When you have a letter that says this is the fort that we built, and then you find something that isn't the fort that was described, it's certainly odd. And I'm still trying to. I think we're still trying to figure out what exactly where that disparity comes from, why things don't look the way they were supposed to as they were written down. But so often in any colonial setting, the reality of on the ground conditions is what shapes everything. That there's a certain amount of prescription of a colonial power sort of goes into something. They write a charter. They have these sort of declarations of what people should do when they get there, and then you get there and everything's different. And sort of the plan goes out the window to a certain extent. So I have a feeling some of that was at play here. And certainly the landscape in which they built their fort had a lot to do with why it's built the way it is. There's a ravine on the north side where it goes down to the creek. There's a ravine on the east side where there was a Native American walking trail that today is Mattaponi Road, the oldest road in Maryland. And so they sort of stuck their fort in between those 2 ravines and put the bastion on the opposite side to really command that open ground. And so maybe the 4-corner or 4-bastioned square fort was the plan, and they got here and said, well, let's use the natural land to our advantage. And so that's just sort of one example of how the written record can really throw you for a loop, and the archaeology can help to balance that, like you said.
Absolutely. And also this idea of continuous occupation on that particular site, right? There's probably a reason strategically that had been selected for over time, and kind of unpacking those layers too of, at what point were, different groups using that site.
Absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I know you found a lot of different types of materials that date to different periods, and how do you decipher that?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the interesting things about working at a site like historic St. Mary's City, where our landscape has been occupied for such a long time. There's this wonderful word that archaeologists and anthropologists often use. The word is palimpsest, and a palimpsest is it comes out of medieval studies, and the word originally means a text that has been sort of erased and rewritten over. That's sort of, so you have this buildup of language over time. But an archaeological site is really a lot like that, particularly in an area like this where the natural environment lends itself to settlement. That there's a reason that people keep coming back to the same place, just as you said, and the same features that were attractive to Indigenous people, that is high ground that's fairly level. That means it's easier to farm. The soils are well drained. It's located right next to a freshwater spring. You're located on sort of the highway of the pre-colonial and colonial period, the waterways, where it's a lot easier to travel. The wildlife is abundant. The riverine resources are abundant. And so it's been a great place for a long period of time. So when we go into an archaeological site, we don't typically expect to only encounter one time period. And in fact, in our work out forward, we've been complicated a little bit by later time periods. It's a good problem archaeologically to have, if you even want to call it a problem. But in the area where the one bastion is, there's a very large late 17th century pit full of really exciting artifacts that post-date the fort, because there was a house that was located right near where that was. And so when we go in and we're thinking, all right, let's go dig that bastion and learn sort of what its role was at St. Mary's Fort, we've got sort of earlier or later layers that we have to peel back and investigate and then remove in order to get down to that earlier stuff. And of course, all of that colonial material is stuck on top of the Indigenous occupation.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And also like thinking about how to animate these sites for the public too, right? Like it's a field at this point. So how and like I'm thinking to like other examples where public archaeology and like these larger stories are permeating popular culture, like thinking about like Jamestown or Plymouth. How do you see this story at historic St. Mary's City being brought to life, and those layers to be revealed, and for people to understand this very complex palimpsest site in a way that is not confusing, right? Like there's a very clear story, but there are many stories. So how do you do that in a way that the public can imagine what happened at this place?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's one of our great challenges, is trying to tie all of these narratives together. And that's one of the reasons we kind of approach things the way we did with the People to People project, because we figured if we can use a sort of a linear path, literally a linear path for our visitors to walk to help establish this long-term history, that will help the fort in context, instead of, as you say, just sort of being a fort out in the middle of a field. But we use a variety of interpretive techniques at the museum that I think have worked to great success, and it's that variety that really helps us. I have a couple slides here I'm going to skip past. Hopefully not too tantalizing. We can come back to those. But we use a method called ghost framing, and ghost frames are like we see here, where you've got a building that's sort of outlined in timber. And it's an inexpensive way of kind of populating the landscape, because for us, one of the big problems that we have is our name contains the word city. And so when people come down to visit us and find out, okay, it doesn't look like the cities that I'm familiar with, what gives? We need a way that's relatively inexpensive to populate our landscape with structures, and ghost framing can really help with that. So that's a technique that we're considering for St. Mary's Fort site. Rather than rebuilding this entire football field sized fort, we can use things like ghost framing to kind of fill in the space and give people a sense of this landscape is occupied. But of course, we do use a variety of other methods, reconstructing buildings to be historically accurate to the 17th century. Here we've got the public inn of Garrett Van Swearingen on the upper left, the reconstructed brick Jesuit chapel on the upper right, and all of that is based on archaeology. We do the archaeology, and then we rebuild these buildings using 17th century methods, using materials that are true to the 17th century, right on the spot where they were originally found. And then in some cases, we do use a combination of interior exhibitry as well. In the case on the bottom here, this is the St. John's Site Museum, where we've taken the archaeological site and actually just put a roof over it and added a gallery next door where you can look at artifacts related to that 17th century site. So I anticipate using some combination of all of these methods of interpretation, and probably many more. We've been looking at digital options, we've been looking at augmented reality, audio tours, the whole works. So we're still very much at the beginning stages of this project, which is exciting. I expect we'll be out there for at least another decade, probably more than that. And archaeology being slow, we'll have plenty of time to sort out what that interpretation is going to look like.
Absolutely. What would you say, other than finding the fort, has been the most exciting discovery? I know that you recently found a Spanish cross. Could you maybe talk to that and what the implications of that might mean for the site?
Sure. I'm actually going to I'm going to do these in reverse, because previously, if someone had asked me what my favorite artifact was, it would have been this one. This is a King Charles I silver shilling that was found by our crew chief, Stephanie Stevens. And this was exciting because, we were in a period in 2019 and 2020 where we were still confirming that, yes, this is indeed St. Mary's Fort. We had the geophys, but we hadn't really dated the site yet. And I said to my crew when they were going out there, they said, what would you like us to find? And I said, well, if you could get me a coin that said 1634 on it, that would be really helpful to date this site. And the coin doesn't exactly say 1634, but it's got this tiny maker's mark that's shown on both sides, this little portcullis shape shown up here. That portcullis maker's mark was in use to the Tower of London in 1633 and 1634. So that was really exciting, just to really help kind of say, all right, we can feel good about this moving forward. This does indeed fit our time description. And we don't tend to find coins. Coins are really rare on our site because very quickly the tobacco economy kicked into gear. And so just about every exchange, whether it's land purchases or just buying a new set of shoes and an axe at the general store, was conducted in pounds of tobacco. And so coinage was really not something that we see a lot. So finding one of these was really great. But you mentioned the Spanish cross. This is just a few images of some of our recent finds. The The objects on the left-hand side are a mix of objects that I really enjoy because they speak to the interactions between colonists and indigenous peoples. You've got a variety of trade beads that were probably manufactured in Europe or even elsewhere. The beads in the upper left-hand corner are carnelian. One of the big manufacturing locations of carnelian beads in the 17th century was India. So these are beads that are being imported into Europe, into England, and then brought over for trade with native peoples. The object on the bottom left is a copper object, what's called a tinkling cone, because you could string it on a cord of leather. And if you have a bunch of those attached to a piece of clothing and you move, they all sort of jangle together and make a tinkling sound. So that's something, again, that would have been produced in Europe and brought over for trade with native peoples. In the upper right-hand corner, there's a gun flint and some pieces of lead shot. We do see a strong militia or military presence in the archaeological record at this site. And then the Spanish cross is on the bottom right there. That's one of our favorite objects. It's really, really small. It's a double-barred copper cross, maybe originally part of a rosary, maybe also just something that was hung on a chain. And it was a style that's very distinctive to the city of Caravaca in Spain. Caravaca was a pilgrimage site. It has a cathedral there that has a number of religious relics, including a piece of the True Cross. And so Caravacan crosses were often given in the 17th century to either ward off the effects of or commemorate the end of pandemics. And so finding a cross like this was November of last year. So it certainly felt like a good omen for us moving forward.
Yeah, that's exciting. Any sort of diagnostic that is going to give you a sense of time or place or origin or interaction is always like a really good sign. So that's amazing. Yeah. I think we're going to invite Margot back now. I know the crowd has been asking a lot of questions, which is great. So we're gonna source some questions from the audience now, unless there's anything else that you wanted to tackle, Travis. I'm assuming you're at the end of your slides.
More or less, yeah. The only thing that I would mention, I'm going to put in a shameless plug, if you don't mind.
Oh, please do.
We have a annual event, public archaeology event every year. This year it will be July 23rd and 24th, which is a Saturday and Sunday. It's called Tidewater Archaeology Weekend. And this is a chance for anyone who's interested to come out to the excavation site and get your hands dirty. You can come screen for artifacts with us. Maybe you'll find another Spanish cross or something even cooler coming out of the site. And we also offer behind the scenes tours of some of our interpretive exhibits, our laboratory. So it's really a great weekend to kind of come and get a sense of archaeology at historic St. Mary's City. But our dig site is open to the public any days that the museum is open. So we're out there Tuesday through, our team is out on the site Tuesday through Friday. And so the museum is open Tuesday through the weekend, but we're not out on the weekend. But so if you ever want to come out, we offer a tour through our museum called the Changing Landscapes Tour. It runs every day, and that tour will bring you out to the dig site so you can see what we're working on if you're not able to make it for Tidewater Weekend. That's
exciting. Any chance to get involved is a good one. So I encourage you all to head on down to St. Mary's. It's a very cool site. I was the thing that took me the most was the ghost structures. They're just so like haunting in a way. I think it's like a good name for it, but also like helps you to really frame what was going on the landscape. So I encourage you all to go down and check it out. So I'm looking through some of these questions and I spy a good one. Have you unearthed any objects that would be subject to NAGPRA during your excavations in St. Mary's City? And have any materials been repatriated? Although I know that is a long process.
It's a great question. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was passed in the early 90s that protects indigenous material culture from anything that's associated with burials and protects burials themselves. So we have not located any burials associated with indigenous people. We have not found any objects that we or any of our community stakeholders have identified as funerary goods. So we have not done anything we have not had anything subjected to or been linked to NAGPRA regulations. It is something we're always mindful of, though, particularly as we're working in an area like the mill field where we know there's been long-term occupation. As archaeologists, finding a burial is always a very sobering moment, but it also, it's a time where we immediately stop and begin a period of assessment and community outreach, that all of which is both required by NAGPRA, but also part of our ethical responsibility as archaeologists. So it's not something we've encountered yet, but we'll see what comes in the future.
Great. Similarly, have any artifacts associated with the site associated with slavery been discovered at the fort location?
Not at the fort location. We haven't found any yet. Finding artifacts associated with slavery is a difficult thing to identify. Usually, if we find something that we think might be linked to an African individual, usually it's going to be something like a cowrie shell, or we have there's particular tobacco pipes that we've found on our site. Just a couple examples that bear resemblance to similar pipes produced by Afro-Caribbean people. But we haven't found anything like that yet. That evidence is pretty slim on our site, but it wouldn't shock me if we did. We know some of the first enslaved people were present in Maryland beginning in the early 1640s, so towards the kind of the tail end of the fort period, but still during a time in which the fort was kind of the center of operations. So again, that may come in the future, and we'll definitely, I imagine that will make news.
What about any graves? Have you excavated any graves at the site?
We haven't excavated any graves at the site, and one of the main reasons for that is because the brick chapel that was built in the late 1660s, that was built on top of, or in a similar position to at least one, probably two earlier wooden chapels that were built in the same space. And we know that was part of the Jesuit mission being such a profound part of the Maryland story. We know chapel construction was something that happened very early on. And so, very early into the story, when people were buried, they tended to be buried over at the chapel grounds as opposed to near the fort or on any other locations. That said, if someone passed away before the chapel was constructed, I would expect that they would be buried in proximity to the fort. But we haven't come across anything that looks like that yet, and the geophysics has not suggested anything either.
Interesting. All right. Here's another good one. Do you have a zooarchaeologist or an archaeobotanist on your team? I'd be super interested in hearing about imported colonial food, livestock, and grains versus native biology, if that was part of your assemblages or study, or if that is a future area of investigation for you.
That's a great question. We don't have a paleoethnobotanist on our team. However, we do collect flotation samples. So we take soil, basically stick it in a tank of agitated water, for the uninitiated, remove anything that floats, because that can be a plant material. And we can take that and then we send it off, in our case, to a specialist who can look through it and identify any salient plant remains for us. We don't have someone who is exclusively a faunal expert on our site, or a zooarchaeologist, but our heritage scholar, Dr. Henry Miller, who's been with the museum for more than 4 decades, happens to be a faunal expert. So he gets to wear a lot of hats around here, in addition to kind of being our resident historian. He does all of our faunal analysis in-house. So we do have a lot of studies that have been done. Dr. Miller's dissertation, in fact, was written on looking at the transition of livestock from sort of wild species into European species into sort of more domesticated local species. And so a lot of that work has been done. It's not always been in-house, but often it is. And so, yeah, that is something we make part of our study for sure.
So I know you've only been working on the site since 2019, but somebody wants to know how deep did you need to dig to find any evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. We get that one a lot. If you come out to our site, people are often surprised that we don't dig deeper than we do. We're about 10 to 12 inches below the ground surface, and that's typically as far as we need to go. Maryland, St. Mary City was the capital of Maryland up until 1695, when the capital was relocated to what is today Annapolis. And that was a bit of a downer for folks in St. Mary's City, but it's really great for the archaeologists because as the capital, sort of all the political and social functions moved up the road, the entire site was converted into agriculture. And so we have this dense soil that built up over time because of the agricultural plowing and growth and sort of replowing that went on over hundreds of years. And so that's done two things in effect. One, it's preserved archaeological sites because you don't have a lot of development that comes with a capital city. But two, it's all that plowing has turned up all of the layers of soil. So when we excavate, we don't see here's a colonial layer, here's an indigenous layer, by and large, because so much of our site is what we call plow zone, which is the sort of that kind of about a foot or so, 10 inches, 12 inches of soil that represents all of human occupation that's been mixed up over time. And once we get below that plow zone, we hit what's called subsoil, which looks very different, tends to be kind of a yellow orangey clay. And it's in that subsoil where we see things like ditches and pits and the remains of timber posts from buildings. All of that's been cut into the subsoil. And so once we get down to the subsoil, we kind of expose it all, clear away all excess soil, and then look for the stains left behind by those various intrusions, again, pits and trenches and all that. So we don't have to go very deep in order to find the evidence from human occupation.
Katie, there's several questions about the fort, specifically
Yes.
about the fort. And one of them, maybe from Alan, was the fort abandoned? And
There's actually
why do you think, yes,
about that? Yeah.
yes. And why do you think, Travis, at this point, do you think it was abandoned? And how long do you think the palisades stood there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know it was built beginning in the spring of 1634, and depending on your perspective of military history, fortunately or unfortunately, it wasn't really in use for very long, and it didn't see a lot of excitement. It was the center of the colony for a period of at least 6, 7, 8 years, but by 1642, really by 1641, Governor Calvert had patented a 100-acre territory in the heart of the capital that was called Governor's Field, and that tract included St. Mary's Fort. And by 1642, Governor Calvert is issuing effectively expulsion orders to the last few people who are still living in the fort. He's sort of saying, okay, this is my land. It's time for you to go build your plantation somewhere along the water. He's trying to encourage sort of the economic growth of, because tobacco takes a lot of land living in the center of town. He's sort of saying, head off and build the economy. And we also know there wasn't any large scale conflict, military conflict. There weren't any engagements that we know of that took place at the fort. And so it may have been seen as unnecessary. And so it likely was allowed to kind of decompose in place or just essentially fall over in the 1640s. They might have wished that they had it, though, because in 1645, there was a short-lived rebellion where a group of folks who were loyal to Cromwell and the parliamentarian government in England sailed over and actually entered the colony, removed the Calverts. The Calverts had to flee. And the rebels fortified Governor Calvert's house. They actually built a palisade around his house itself. So because we don't hear anything associated with that conflict happening at St. Mary's Fort, I believe those walls were probably either entirely down or at least in pretty bad repair by the mid 1640s.
Interesting. I think one more question, Margot. Yeah. How about, okay, here's a good one. So do you ever work with descendants of Indigenous tribes who previously occupied these sites? And how do you maintain those relationships? And I know that is kind of the crux of the People Project, which you mentioned earlier. Can you speak more to that?
Sure. Yeah, I didn't highlight the fact that the People to People initiative is designed to be a collaborative, community driven endeavor. That we are engaged in dialogues with members of the Piscataway Conoy tribe, the Piscataway Indian Nation, the Choptico Band of the Piscataway, a variety of other groups to really make sure that we're telling these stories as appropriately as possible, and in acknowledgement that folks like me and other museum employees are not the people to tell these stories, of Indigenous life. And so I would say that the project is very much in its infancy, but we are engaged in ongoing dialogues with members of the community. And the perspectives that we're looking for to help guide any of the research, help construct research questions, participation in programming, in designing interpretation, all of that is really designed to be a collaboration as opposed to something that the museum is just projecting outwards. Because again, these aren't our stories to tell. We're just trying to create an avenue of discourse that will yield interesting and useful interpretation for the public.
Yeah, and many perspectives too, right? Like that's always the challenge in any sort of museum work. It's bringing all of those multiple perspectives together to give a fuller view of the past, because we know we'll never be able to share all of it. So it's really like making sure we're intentionally asking those questions to make sure that as many voices as possible are represented and able to speak for themselves. So that's wonderful to hear.
I think we can do one more.
Which one do you want, Margot?
Well, I have answered to some people privately. There were some that we could take offline there, but there were still some questions about the fort, the size, and the difference between what you find archaeologically and maybe any exaggeration that possibly could have been done through the written records. And I guess what the difference, you've already touched on some at the beginning of the conversation, but maybe just reviewing the differences that you saw and the struggle, the challenge that you had even finding the fort because of those written records.
Absolutely, yeah. When we got the geophysical results back with the ground penetrating radar, it was definitely a moment of, hey, this is really cool, but why does it look so strange? Why does it not look like what we expected it to look like? And that question was perturbing, particularly because Governor Calvert wrote his letter 2 months at least after the colonists had arrived and started building the fort. So it's not necessarily that he was describing a finished product, but there was at least a plan in place. So it remains a little strange that he was describing something that didn't quite fit with what we're seeing archaeologically. But I think that the word exaggeration seems to be where we keep coming back to. He's writing again to one of the financiers of the colonial endeavor, someone who may or may not ever make it over to the colony and see this fort. So there may not have been any harm in sort of goosing the numbers a little bit and saying like, oh, it's the biggest fort, it's the best fort, it's the tallest walls, et cetera. There may have been a little bit of that at play. We also know that there was an attempt by another individual, a man named William Claiborne, who was operating out of a Kent Island. He had a fur trading and various just big trading posts set up on that island. And he was none too pleased when the Maryland contingent came in because he saw them as a threat to his burgeoning trade enterprise. And so he started spreading rumors amongst the indigenous tribes saying, on one hand, that the Maryland colonists were disingenuous, that they were going to stab their allies in the back. At one point, rumor came around that the Marylanders were actually Spanish, which is kind of an interesting threat to suggest. And so the colonists got wind of this, were concerned about their placement in the sort of diplomatic web of Southern Maryland. So they describe sort of rushing to complete the fort. So there's always this hypothesis that's kind of lingering of, well, did it start like it was going to be 120 yards square with 4 beautiful corner bastions, and then it was like, oh, we really need to hurry up and wrap this thing up. So they finished it up quickly. I don't know how much stock I put in that, but it is another piece of data from the historical record that we're trying to jockey with. And my hope is that as we continue and excavate pieces of the palisade, we may be able to refine our dates and really look at sort of the different methods of construction from areas of the wall that maybe were very finely built versus areas that weren't. And that may give us some clues as well.
Very interesting. We're so excited to find out what comes next, right? Like what is the next piece of evidence or your next question even? So we'll definitely be staying tuned and looking forward to maybe having another conversation once you've revealed some more interesting evidence from the past.
Sounds great.
Yes, thank you so much, Travis, for bringing your images. I know everyone out there attending today really enjoyed them and even wanted to see more. And we have several people who are already planning a trip down to Southern Maryland to St. Mary's to check it out. So thank you very much, Katie, for being in conversation with Travis. And Travis, thank you again very much for sharing your current research and your thoughts. And we hope to see you soon with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Till next time.